Friends, I'd like to introduce you to Reverend Stacy Rector. Pastor Rector is a native of Dyersburg, Tennessee, a graduate of Rhodes College and Columbia Theological Seminary, and she is an ordained Presbyterian minister. She served as the associate pastor of Second Presbyterian Church in Nashville for 9 years. And in 2006, Reverend Rector became the executive director of Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. It's an organization that works to honor life by abolishing the death penalty, preventing violence, and supporting those who experience harm. She also served as spiritual advisor to Steve Henley, an inmate on Tennessee's death row who was executed in 2009. Reverend Rector served as the vice president of the National Board of People of Faith Against the Death Penalty and the boards of UKirk Nashville, which is a Presbyterian campus ministry, and Community Shares Tennessee. She is currently active in the Presbytery of Middle Tennessee and serves on the Presbytery's Social Justice Committee. Pastor Rector, thank you so much for being with us. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. I think Lizzie's going to ask your first question.
Well, Stacey, can you tell us a bit about your work and how you became engaged in your work?
Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, as you just heard in the introduction, is a statewide organization. We work to honor life by abolishing the death penalty, preventing violence, and supporting those who experience harm. We, work all over the state with all sorts of partners, including faith communities, universities, civic organizations, basically whoever will have us, to educate people about what we believe are the terrible flaws with the death penalty system and with the larger criminal legal system, and the ways that we are continuing to double down on very punitive measures in our system that have not proven to make us safer. So we are, that's what we do day in and day out. I got involved, basically, it was sort of a journey to the issue via doing some work in Memphis when I was a college student, with young people, and particularly Black kids who I was seeing interfacing with the legal system way more than the predominantly white kids I was going to college with, and how systems were working differently. And when I was in seminary in Georgia, at that time it was 1993, as a native Tennessean, we had the death penalty on the books here for a very long time, but had not executed anyone in Tennessee since 1960. When I got to Georgia, that was very different. Executions were happening. And I began to get involved with a community called the Open Door Community, which is similar to a Catholic worker community. I don't know if folks are familiar with that, but Presbyterian ministers started this community, and they were in solidarity and community with people in prison and on death row, as well as people living on the street. And that's kind of my first entree into really the issue. And throughout it, I was obviously having this conversation with myself about my faith, my life as a disciple of Jesus, and how the death penalty fit into that, and continued to come up against my belief that it wasn't compatible with my faith, and that I just became profoundly convicted about that. The movie Dead Man Walking came out during that period of time, Sister Helen Prejean's story. And when I moved back to Tennessee to serve a church here in Nashville, it was the very end of 97, and the state there was a lot of tough on crime policies being talked about. The governor had sort of made it one of his agenda items to restart executions here. So I kind of got thrown into that as a young clergy person, into that conversation, began to visit someone on death row, and just really felt God's call that this is what I needed to be doing if I could find a way to do it as my vocation. And ultimately, that is what happened. I got involved with this organization and was a board member and a volunteer. And then in 2006, was ultimately hired as the director. And so I've been doing that since that time. And, as I tell people, I primarily come to the issue of the death penalty from my faith, but also from a personal perspective, having served as a spiritual advisor for someone who I visited for over 10 years, and through the stories of so many people impacted by homicide and murder, and the families that struggle in the aftermath of that, the families of those on death row, just the ripple effects on so many people. So there's a faith perspective, there's a personal perspective, but then there's the policy perspective and the question of, does this even work? And if what are the goals? What are the things that we believe the death penalty is going to accomplish for us as a society? And if it's not doing that, sort of regardless of our moral positions, why are we continuing to have it? So that's a long answer to your question, but that's kind of how I got here. And we continue to do this work kind of on from all those perspectives, from the faith, from the personal, from the policy, as we're trying to engage and educate folks in Tennessee about it.
Could you name some of the injustices that we are facing with the death penalty?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, again, I certainly have moral qualms with it, and recognize that all Christian denominations don't.
Yeah.
I do, and I'm certainly happy to talk more about that. My biblical moral position on it. But in terms of the policy itself, um, what we know about it is it's extremely arbitrary and unfairly applied. The amount of money you have in your bank account, the color of your skin, whether or not you have a mental health issue, what county you live in, those factors are more impactful on whether or not you end up with the death penalty than the crime itself, right? So a person could be charged with the same crime in Memphis and in Nashville. In Memphis, they're going to be more likely to end up on death row and executed than they would in Nashville, simply because of the county, right? And we have counties in this state that have never sought the death penalty, even for multiple murder, and counties like Memphis who have sought it historically for someone who was not even directly responsible for the murder. Right. So it's just this very, very disparate application. And we can see all sorts of issues with who ends up getting the death penalty, right? We know it's far more costly to maintain the death penalty system than systems that don't have it. We already have alternatives that can ensure public safety and accountability without it. And those are dollars we're not spending on mental and behavioral health care, on investing in our young people, particularly young people who have experienced trauma and violence. We're not investing that in education. We're not investing that in prenatal care, all these things that we know ultimately impact whether or not someone is going to end up committing violent crime, right? And instead, we're waiting until the crime's committed, and then we're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars to pursue death for someone who's already in prison, right? We know this process is extremely long. It has to be. We still are sentencing and likely executing innocent people. Are up to almost 200 people who've been exonerated from death row in this country since 1972, which means for every 8.2 executions we've had, we've let someone go because we were wrong. And those are the people we figured it out in time. So we know we need the appeals, we need the time for people to try to have their innocence acknowledged by the courts. But what that means is that then families of victims are trapped in a process for 30 years, and are basically stuck in the worst moment of their lives in that trauma space for 30 years. There's no ability to have finality. And again, I believe this only re-traumatizes people over and over, as opposed to sort of really thinking about and talking to people about what is it that you really need and how could we be walking with you to really provide things that will help your family to heal and to recover financially and all the other impacts that murder has on families, as opposed to, okay, maybe in 30 years, maybe, because a lot of times it doesn't happen, we'll execute this person on your behalf, right? Um, so those are just some of the biggest pieces of why we think this system is completely bankrupt in terms of anything it's providing for us as a state. We're not safer because of it. We're spending a lot more money on it that we're not spending on things that are actually preventative. We're risking executing innocent people. We're dragging victims' families and the families of those on death row through 30 years of legal process that is not in any way, shape, or form a sure thing, right? And the list goes on and on. So when you really put down on a piece of paper, what is it that we think this is achieving or accomplishing? The answer is none of the above. And that's where we're really finding a lot more traction with people from across the political spectrum, the religious spectrum, who may in fact believe that there is some biblical justification for the death penalty, but once they start to look at the in practice how this current system works, they begin to say, okay, maybe I can justify it biblically, but we can't do it in a just way, and therefore we shouldn't have it.
This week we are in a series in Lent talking about justice, and so this is partly why we're talking to you today. And today our text is from Proverbs 31, verses 8 through 9, which says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those who are being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and helpless and see that they get justice." You've already kind of talked a little bit about the impact of the death penalty on families and how it's applied differently based on race and income, economic status, and things like that. But I wonder if you could share a little bit more about kind of what does it mean to you as a Christian to speak up for the poor and helpless in this context?
Well, I mean, I think it's critically important for all of us, particularly Christians, obviously, who follow Jesus and his teaching and his way, to do that in all sorts of ways. It's important to listen to the people who are the most impacted by these policies to really understand what it is that they need and what it is that, we can do to try to meet those needs and to partner with them in working toward those solutions. I don't have the answers to how to go about doing justice in our current context. I have to look to Jesus and to the people most impacted to help me understand, and to give me the ideas and the words to speak and the actions to take. Um, I think it is profoundly important that we understand as a society that violence has a context. And if people's basic needs are not met, they do not feel safe. And they are living out of fear, just as, the narrative, I think, so often for us in our society is fear-based. We're afraid of everybody. We're afraid there's not enough. We're afraid of people that don't look like us, don't believe what we do, all the fear-based. And it's easier to say than to do, but as Christians, we have to live out of our faith, not out of our fear. And part of that is, I think, stepping back and really looking at least in my world of doing the legal system, what is the context out of which violence is happening. And what you see, it's coming out of poverty, it's coming out of lack of opportunity, educational opportunities, trauma, unaddressed trauma, particularly of children. Um, there is and frankly, the current system that we have with, 2.3 million people who are incarcerated in this country, and I don't even know the number that are under the system in some way, not incarcerated, but somehow, within the system, and what that does to communities and families, the disruptions, the inability to get work, the inability to find places to live. So you just start adding all that up. And um, for me, part of speaking up for um, people who are not heard often is, in my context, really helping us to see that this punitive approach to address violence in our community is failing and has failed. It is not achieving what we want, which is all of us to have a sense of safety and well-being. And so, part of what I'm trying to do is tell a different story, um, and tell a story where people are getting what they need, where accountability doesn't look like warehousing somebody for 40 years or executing somebody. It looks like, yes, making sure that people are safe and protected, but that we are trying to figure out what is it, who's been harmed, how do we address that harm, and how do we help the person who has caused the harm to deal with that and to grow and learn and change. Because most of the time, the person who has committed the harm themselves was harmed, and it has never been addressed. So I don't know if that answers your question, Erin, but it's, obviously we all can uh, in our own lives, whatever ways we have passion and drive around certain things, um, figure out how to listen to the people who are being impacted, and then figure out how we can use our voices, our connections, our influence, whatever that may be, to really give them that voice that they need.
If someone wanted to help get involved with this, with Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, what are some things that how can they plug in?
Sure. Well, the number one thing is to get on our email list, and can go to TennesseeDeathPenalty.org and join the list, because that's going to get you all the action alerts, all the things that are going to tell you, okay, here's a petition to sign, here's an event to attend, here's a lawmaker to call, and here's just information about what's going on. Here are some of the cases. Here are some of the situations that we're dealing with in this country right now, and the ways that you can get involved. So that's the first thing. One of the things I really encourage people, once you have the information, then share it. Talk to people in your faith communities. Watch a film and have a discussion, read a book, have a discussion, have somebody come in and speak, like me or somebody directly impacted. Education on our issue, with the idea that once people have the information, we'll give them the tools and the ways to then use that to change things. The support for the death penalty is a mile wide and an inch deep, right? And when you ask people, if you just ask people, do you support the death penalty, you're going to get a majority that say yes. But if you say, would you rather see the death penalty or these other options, right? The majority of people choose another option. So it's the way we ask the question. And I think people more and more are learning that the system we have just isn't working and cannot be trusted. to do something like decide who lives and dies, right? I mean, this is the ultimate punishment. Um, and and that's just what it is a punishment, because there is nothing about it that is redemptive in any way or that addresses any of the reasons why this violent act occurred in the first place. So yeah, email list is number one, but then once you're more informed, how do you then share that information? How do you begin to be a voice that is educating people about why we don't need this anymore? We never did, but we certainly don't now.
What would you say to a churchgoer who doesn't believe the church should have a role in justice work?
I think the first thing I would want to do in that situation is to really listen to the reason why they believe that. Um, because I think I would need to understand from their perspective where they're coming from. Um, Doing this work for as long as I have learned that I need to probably listen first to where people are coming from, and then figure out, okay, what is the common ground that we have that we can then start building on. Um, you know, but assuming that we're having that conversation, this church person and myself, I would want to talk about what it means not just to worship Jesus, but to follow Jesus. He did not talk about worshiping him. He talked about following him. And as a disciple, that's what we're to do. And that means that we follow his lead. Um, Jesus, everything Jesus did was political because his radical love challenged every system structure. It challenged our own blinders personally and societally, right? So there's no way to love in the manner of Jesus, no matter how imperfectly, and not end up challenging the politics of the day, right? I would want to be thoughtful and pastoral as I had that conversation with folks, but not back off of the reality that Jesus was executed by the state for a reason. And it wasn't just because he was sweet and telling people they were going to go to heaven. I mean, the state didn't care about that. The state cared about him saying, my teachings and the community I'm here to fulfill, your allegiance, your heart is there, not with any power of this world, right? And that's a threat. That's a threat when the way of love versus the way of power, um, oppressive power, right? And you're going to bump up against it every time you go into the world and express that kind of love and justice, right? That justice that comes out of that sort of love. So I don't know where that conversation would go. I've had it many times, but I do try to always listen to where that person's coming from and see if we can figure out some places where we agree, and then how do we move a little bit further down the road and keep that conversation going as much as we can. Because sometimes we just don't know how long it's going to take. And we don't want to slam a door. We want to leave a door open for continued growth. And I always learn something from other people who vehemently disagree with me, right? I try to be bold, but I try to also be very humble and listen. And what is it I need to be learning from this conversation?
I do know that there are more churches beginning to have conversations on the importance of justice work. I think that's wonderful. What I found over the years in facilitating conversations, especially on race, is that many church folks are more comfortable having the conversation, but the practical aspect of it, they're not quite ready for that. So
Mhm.
how do you think we could empower churches to step outside of the church, outside of the, four walls of the church, and actually engage people, organizers, grassroots organizations that are actually doing the work? How do we empower them to do that?
That's a great question, and if I knew the answer, you would be the first to know. It's a challenge, right? One thing I think, and this is something I've learned, is that proximity is obviously so important, getting close to the people who are the most harmed. And that can be, or most impacted. And that can be difficult inside, like you're saying, when you're inside the church walls, you're basically asking them to come to you, you know? So how do we be creative about how do we get the church folk out to where people are, who are living the reality of whatever this injustice is, so that they can be more impacted by it. And obviously, it's great to have people come in and talk. That's a good thing. It's good to have, I think that can move people. But one of the things at Second Presbyterian Church where I served, and I got this from the community in Atlanta that I was part of, the Open Door community. One of the things we decided to do was, okay, look, this church is in Green Hills. How much are we in Green Hills in Nashville going to engage with people who are unhoused, or people who are, you know, uh, struggling with various things? We need to sort of figure out a way to go to them, right? And so we started doing an Easter sunrise service breakfast down at Room in the Inn. And this was back when it was called Campus for Human Development. So basically, we just moved church there, and did Easter sunrise service there, and it's still going on. It's been 20 something years. They're still doing it. That's just one idea, but I think it's really important to try to figure out creatively, how do we get folk out of this building in a way that there's some comfort that they want, are, like, can you have a church service somewhere else? Can you figure out ways to pull people outside of the walls? And again, I don't pretend that that's easy to do. But I do think getting proximate to the actual people that are impacted is so critical, and getting those stories is very critical to really move people to do something. Still doesn't mean they will do something, but
Uh,
I think you're more likely to if you're directly engaged or impacted with someone who is in a situation that, you know, challenges your own assumptions, and sometimes just our own, like, tunnel vision in our own lives and our own busyness.
And I think a lot of people in the church feel that these issues are more personal.
Mhm.
Like if they don't see themselves as a racist or someone who is complicit, they don't really feel compelled to get involved with that work. But I really believe we're better in numbers with this work. And if we could just stand in our power and
Mhm.
stand in our numbers, we could cover so much ground as a church. So that's my hope, that we can empower more people to get involved and see that these issues aren't just personal, they're about our communities, and that we
Yes.
all need to be engaged in that work.
Well, and churches just have to stop being so fearful too,
Yeah.
about upsetting, and right, what if we lose money? What if this? What if that? Well, you know what? Okay, so what? Like, and I'm not saying you don't try to lead people. You don't just, okay, here's what we're going to do, with no sort of preparation or leading folks, educating folks. You want to do all the preparatory work, but at some point, like you're saying, you can have conversations all day long, and that's important, but they need to lead you somewhere. right?
Exactly.
And so at some point, folks are going to have to move beyond the what if, in terms of this sustainability of the institution and say, no, this is our calling as disciples of Jesus to do this work. It may look differently for everybody. Not everybody's going to feel comfortable doing everything, but we got to think about ways to engage people in whatever capacities that they're able to be engaged, but to do it,
Yeah.
right? And not just talk about it. And I 100% think that, and again, that's the challenge, right? And how do we get beyond our scarcity and fear thinking inside the church? Because it's as bad inside the church as anywhere, because we're
Oh,
so worried about sustainability.
Amen.
yes.
One last question, and I didn't send this to you ahead of time, but I'm
Okay.
wondering about this is hard work. I imagine the work that you do is emotionally draining and taxing. And I think a lot of justice work can be hard. It's hard work. It's hard
Yes.
coming up against systems um, and patterns of operating that are unjust and trying to move the needle is hard. So I'm wondering, what are some practices that you have personally that kind of help you to stay grounded and to kind of persevere in the midst of that hard work?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big thing for me, and this isn't necessarily a practice, but it's something I have to remind myself of constantly through my scripture reading and just reading in general about the issue, about the fact that this work is God's work, and that I believe it is already but not yet, right? That we are living into something that will be, and so there's a hope there. It's not naivete at all, because I'm battered and beaten every day by the system itself and then by the resistance to change, right? Um, but my hope is not in the systems. My hope is in the God that is with us in Jesus, and who I believe, you know, is a God of resurrection, is a God of new life, is a God that can bring beauty and life and love out of the worst situations. God doesn't cause those situations. I always want to be clear, but God can redeem those situations in certain ways and help us learn and grow. Um, so that's like a constant thing for me, just having to remind myself of that. This isn't on me. Like, I'm participating in something God is doing, right? Um, so having said that, and that I have to constantly be reminding myself of that, or otherwise you can get very down about you're not doing enough, or it's not happening fast enough, or all those things. You know, prayer is very important to me, and I'm a walker. I walk practically every day for about an hour, and that's my prayer and quiet time when I sort of really get centered and recharged. And like I said, I do a lot of reading and both scripture and theology and those sorts of things. I do yoga. I do some yoga every day. Um, I try to make sure I am doing things that are joyful, laughing, hanging out with people, like just living my life and not being so consumed by this really heavy stuff. Um, and I have a great team. I think that's a huge, having community, having amazing colleagues like the staff of TDP, the larger community of folks working in the death penalty and do violence prevention are incredible human beings, and are really good about um, walking with those of us in the states in particular where the majority of the ugly is happening. States particularly that are actively executing. Um, so, I feel so blessed to be in work that has that kind of community and that kind of support. That's so critical. And my own church community here in Nashville, and the friends and family and all that. But yeah, so that's again, there are days when I want to curl up in a ball on the ground, and sometimes do. But I get up eventually. So, and that's the hope that's there. Even when I don't feel like it, I get up. And so some days that's all we can, that's a victory right there, you know.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you for the work that you do. I can see the impact, and um, I can imagine that this will be an enlightening conversation for a lot of folks. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you all for inviting me, and I I love talking about the work. It's hard work, but I just think it's so critically important. And I think folks just don't know. A lot of it
Mhm.
is they don't know. And we've got to help them learn and understand. And then think about their faith in light of what they're learning,
Mhm.
and then give them the tools to do something about it. So I appreciate the opportunity so much. And thank you all for what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our prayers are with you. And if there's any way that we can support your work, please let us know.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
One thing we've learned from the early church and the early Methodist movement is the importance of community. God never intended us to walk this journey of faith alone. At the Vine, we have launched what we're calling branches, which are small groups that can help you find community where you are. Visit our website if you're interested in joining a branch.